Hello, greetings. Still figuring out this new Facebook live stream software. Think it's working. Hi, everyone. So, I want to share this teaching that is crucially important in these times of heightened uncertainty, heightened stress for some people, heightened fear for some people. And like any powerful key teaching, this applies actually in all times, but it might be especially useful now, or you might realize its effectiveness more fully now. So, you have probably heard me talk about or seen me write about the significance of the stories or narratives that we tell about our experience, about life, about virtually every aspect of our reality. And previously, I've emphasized quite a bit how our narratives or representations, mental representations of reality, tend to influence us towards more suffering. And so, in that light, we view these stories or narratives as problematic. But I'd like to highlight the other side of the coin now. I often say thoughts are tools, not truths. That is expressing the positive side of narratives. Because again, often we're just telling stories about what's happening that are based in our conditioning, and our conditioning is usually not entirely healthy. And so those narratives perpetuate suffering. But stories, or rather frames, ways of framing our experience, can also be incredibly powerful, useful tools that can create a more healthy, salutary experience. And so this is what I want to focus on, because those of you who've absorbed these teachings, or parallel versions of these teachings that many other teachers have presented, you might be at risk of simply dismissing the narrativizing function of the brain, of your mind. And that's not a good idea, because what we want to do is avail ourselves of those ways of framing our experience that can really create a much more beneficial, positive, healthful experience for not only you, but for everyone connected to you, for the benefit of all beings. So that's what I want to talk about now. So I want to talk about both how we frame experience that's happening, in this very moment, and how we can also frame it in a larger context. So something I've been, contemplating more recently, and started to share with you guys, is that really emotions are nothing but interpreted bodily sensations. It's a little bit more complicated than that, because there's not only bodily sensations, there's also what we might call a feeling tone to one's conscious experience in any given moment. But it doesn't become emotion until it's interpreted. And that interpretation is crucial. That interpretation is our um, access point to a whole different possibility. Okay, so I want to get into that more. And by the way, here I want to give props and credit to a brilliant TED talk by a very, very good researcher, stroke scientist, Lisa Feldman Barrett. And I'll link to that in the comments after the video is done. Because she also says this same thing based on lots and lots and lots of research, that she actually calls emotions guesses. I would call them interpretations of, again, bodily sensations, which she talks about, and feeling tone to consciousness, which she doesn't. But by feeling tone, I again mean something in experience prior to interpretation, prior to narrativization, right? So that's important. Now, this is perhaps at first a difficult thing to wrap your head around, but I'll just give a couple of examples. And one is an example that Lisa Barrett gives, that when one is, say, about to take a test. Yes, that one. When one is about to take a test, one might be feeling extremely nervous, or see, this is the whole point. One might be feeling sensations that one interprets as nervousness. And if you interpret them as nervousness, that's actually lowers your chances of doing well on the test. But there is a possibility, and this takes practice, if you can reframe your experience consciously and say, oh, actually what I'm feeling is excitement. I'm feeling the excitement of about to be the excitement of being about to ace the test. Whoa, that's exciting. My heart is pounding with excitement because I'm about to ace this test. Now, if you are doing this for the first time, it's probably not going to work that great. You're going to feel that I'm fooling myself. I'm really nervous, but I'm telling myself a story. I'm going to ace the test. But what I want to convince you of here is that there is no such thing as really nervous. There isn't. There's just the bodily sensations, right? And then how you narrativize them and how you frame them makes all the difference to what unfolds in the very next moment and the next moment and the next moment, okay? So in that sense, it's neither narrativization is actually true. I'm nervous, I'm excited, right? Because they're both equally interpretations, right? So if it doesn't, feel quite right, or if it doesn't feel convincing to say, oh no, I'm going to try to tell this story, what works better for me is what I call opening to the possibility of. And so, for example, I'm opening to the possibility that what I'm sensing is better labeled excitement than nervousness. Okay. And why might I be excited? Well, maybe because this is a breakthrough moment and I'm about to ace this test. Could be. So for me, it's simply more convincing, more real to say, oh, I'm opening to that possibility than to say, no, this is what's happening. Because of course I know, more in the back of my head, as it were, that the interpretation is an interpretation. Now, so this is just a way of nuancing the practice so it becomes more effective. So, also in this TED talk, Lisa Barrett points out that you can experience stomach churning, and if you're in a bakery, you're going to interpret that as hunger, assuming you liked baked goods. And if you're in a hospital room, you're going to interpret that as fear. But it's the exact same sensation, actually. So emotions are not given to us. What's given to us are bodily sensations, and also this, what I'm calling feeling tone of consciousness, prior to label, prior to interpretation. Because as soon as you have the interpretation, of course, that creates a feedback loop in which it starts influencing the sort of direction of those sensations and that feeling tone. Okay, so that's really important to realize. Now, another example, I'm not just drawing from this one TED talk, by the way. There's lots of research on this, and another great researcher is Laurie Santos at Yale, and she cites studies that are very, very, very interesting. For example, where subjects, and this is in a controlled, environment, subjects are given stimulants, and like a stimulant drug, a mild stimulant drug, which creates a kind of intensity or sense of agitation because there's a kind of central nervous system activation, right? Now, if the people are in a party-like environment, they respond to those sensations given by the drug that's the central nervous system stimulator very, very differently than if they're in an environment around people who are angry, upset, and aggressive, right? So they're having the same sensations, they're on the same dosage of the same drug, but in one context, the party context, they think, "Wow, this is so great! We're having a great time." And in another context, they're the same sensations they interpret as agitation, in a negative sense. So part of what this research shows is that framing is everything, not only to how you're experiencing these sensations, that get interpreted as emotion, but also how you remember the experience. So you can actually, with practice, write different memories to your brain, right? Because your brain, in this vis-a-vis memory, your brain is a bit like a hard drive. It doesn't work actually quite the same way, but it's analogous, right? So how you write those memories is important. Yes, and you can always through therapy and stuff, learn to rewrite your memories later. But that's much harder than controlling or influencing, rather, the way in which you write the memories in the first place. Okay, so whenever you're kind of labeling your affective state, which is maybe a more accurate term than emotion. However you're labeling it in the moment, that's going to influence how you remember the experience, and the accumulation of your memories is what gives you the sense of that you've had a good life for the last however many years, or that you've had a terrible life, right? And the thing is, that matters, because if you believe that you've had a terrible life or a challenging life for the last few years, or a great life for the last few years, that's going to actually influence, how you wake up each morning, to a great extent for most people, not for all, of course. There's the possibility of spiritual awakening and liberation, in which, which is a game changer in that regard. But for most people, it's a huge influence. But the thing is, there's no reality to this, inherent reality to this story of I've been having a hard time or I've been doing great. It all has to do with how you're writing your memories. And how you're writing your memories has everything to do with how you're framing the experience moment to moment. Okay? So here's what I'm specifically inviting, that you consider when you're having an experience that, oh, what are the bodily sensations, right? Start from the basics. This is, of course, a very tantric practice, as well as being just good use of application of psychology. What am I viscerally experiencing prior to interpretation? Okay, what does it feel like to be me before I have a thought about it, before I have a label? Let me just get in touch with these sensations, and yeah, you could label the sensations if you want, but it's really neither here nor there, right? Get in touch with the sensations, get in touch with what it feels like to be you before you have a thought about it. Okay, and you'll notice that there is, negative emotions are not something that's given in direct experience. Now, you might feel intensity in direct experience. You might feel, like there's a rock, a sinking ball of denseness in the middle of your chest in direct experience. And because of your cultural conditioning, it's very tempting to interpret that as a negative emotion. But what if you get curious about it? What if you breathe into it without trying to banish it, and just be with the experience lovingly? It will change the valence of your experience. Now, you can then, come up with a new, more salutary narrative, or if you have enough meditation practice, maybe you don't need a narrative at all. Maybe you don't need to tell a story about this to in order to make it okay. Maybe you can just remind yourself that it is inherently okay to be feeling whatever you're feeling, and breathe into it, be with it. Don't try to banish it, but also don't try to hold on to it, right? And as soon as you make a story like I'm having a really challenging time, that is holding on to it, by the way. You're actually clinging to your experience, but by narrativizing it in that way, right? As opposed to, you could say, I'm having a temporary sensation. It's not entirely comfortable. I want to get curious about it, and then of course you might discover a hidden underlying story. You might discover, something. There's some sense of what you might call dread, for example. But again, if it's labelable as dread, it's because there's an underlying hidden story. Like, I'm not going to be okay. The world's coming to an end. Maybe someone I know will die. And that gives rise to the dread, right? Because otherwise, you can't experience dread. It's impossible, because dread has to do with the anticipation of what you think might happen, even if the thinking is subconscious. Okay? Now, again, what you can experience without a story is intensity. But intensity is not dread. Intensity is not fear, right? And so it's important to exercise some discernment and see, if this is really if this inescapably feels like dread or fear, where's the story? Let me investigate that. Now, story is a projection about a possible future, and in a sense, it's an act of egotism. Fear is an act of egotism because it's the belief, that you can accurately project what's more likely out of infinite possible futures. And that's very, arrogant in a certain way. And it might be not intuitive for you to frame it in this way, but it can be helpful to frame fear as an act of egotism, that you could possibly know which of the infinite possible futures is in fact going to actualize. You can't know that. And when you truly know you can't know that, something deep inside relaxes, right? There's still this aliveness in knowing that there are infinite possibilities, and that aliveness, if you're not used to it, might have a slight tinge that you even interpret as fear, but it's not. It's the aliveness of openness to the great unknown. Okay. Now, one more important way of framing. Okay, and this is framing in terms of how your future self would like to remember the experience. Okay, now again, this is narrative, but it's the useful and positive and healthy side of narrative, of storytelling, and it works for most people. Okay, so what I'm talking about now is you're having an experience, or you're about to have an experience, and you ask yourself, how would my future self want to remember this experience? And then you immediately start framing it in those terms, right? So let's say right now you consider that you're going through a challenging time, okay? So, it turns out that's not such a useful story unless you frame it from the perspective of your future self, because your future self is going to want to tell the story, wow, I went through a challenging time and I came through it. And I learned valuable lessons, and I grew as a person, and it cracked my heart open, and I'm better and stronger for it, and I value my relationships more because of it, right? So that changes the narrative substantially from just, oh, this is really hard, So contemplate. This is really powerful. Contemplate how, the story your future self would like to tell about the experience, and then make that your experience, because you can. Because there is no such thing as an independently existing emotion, meaning independent of framing, independent of how you're framing it. And by the way, framing is contagious. When people around you are all framing in a particular way, it's very hard not to join them. Because we are tribal, because we have primate brains primarily, we have this wonderful addition called the prefrontal cortex, but we primarily have these primate brains. And so the framing is contagious. We take it on from our group, from our tribe, from our family. Okay. But in the context of the spiritual path, we talk about liberation. That's part of liberation, freeing yourself from that compulsive contagion, from taking on other people's frames. So nowadays people are talking about taking on other people's energy or taking on other people's emotion, but that's not actually what happens. What actually happens is you take on their frame, and that influences how you're interpreting your emotion. And before you know it, you think you're having the same emotion as them, and indeed maybe it is similar, because framing creates that feedback loop, which then influences the moment-to-moment direction of your emotional experience. Okay, so the other day I posted in the group this beautiful little bit of poetry about Mirabai, the great female poet saint of India, one of the great ones. There's many, and the first two lines of this poem says, "Mira unraveled the fetters of family. She sundered the chains of shame." It's so fascinating. She unraveled the fetters of family, right? This doesn't mean she stopped caring about her family, right? It means she became liberated in the sense she freed herself from this compulsion of taking on the other people's frames for experience. She became self-determining, right? Again, that doesn't inhibit your connection with other people if you want to connect with other people. It actually doesn't. And you might not believe that until you see it for yourself, but it doesn't. In fact, you can connect with others more when you don't feel sort of compelled by their narrative frames. You can empathize, you can have compassion, you can understand where they're coming from, but you're not actually adopting the contagion of their narrative frame. And so could we consider that contagion just as or more injurious to human health than a virus, a physical virus? Yes. If we're talking about mental health, for sure. In terms of mental health, the contagion of taking on other people's frame is more injurious than any virus could be to your mental health. Okay? So you are not at the mercy of your emotions. And I did sort of steal that title from Lisa Bennett, but it's such a great title. It deserves to be reused and repurposed by all of us. You are not at the mercy of your emotions because you construct your emotions. They don't happen to you. Emotions don't happen to you. They are constructed by how you're interpreting and framing your bodily sensations and the feeling tone of consciousness. Okay. Encounter these variety of sensations, if you can, and these feeling tones as the many, many shades of light and darkness in a beautiful painting. Right? We have that incredible sutra that goddess consciousness unfolds or unfurls the universe of experience, of phenomena upon her very own canvas. So it's this metaphor of like experiencing the exquisite beauty of the painting of your life, which would be incredibly boring if it was all just like, bright yellow, painted on the whole canvas, right? Nobody wants to look at that painting. Nobody wants to experience that, even if they think they do. They don't. Um, so again, I'm just talking prior to interpretation, right? Because there's no doubt that the interpretations can create suffering and happiness, but just prior to interpretation, that there's a beauty in the variety of feeling tones of consciousness. And then to realize I can start to choose how I interpret these, if I have to interpret them at all. And that makes all the difference in the world. And it both to your experiencing self and your remembering self. Okay. So I'll see if there's some questions, comments, shares, complaints, objections. Those are all useful. So yeah, Anouk notes that the English word feeling comes from the Latin root sensus, and emotion comes from emotus. They come from these different linguistic roots. And what's the significance of that? Well, emotus means moving, but really here in the sense of expressing. So emotions are things we express, not things that we sense. So that totally supports what I've been arguing here, and others, of course, other scientists I've mentioned, that what we express can only be interpreted, right? Now, some have pointed out that it's really important some here in the group, have pointed out that it's important to help kids learn how to express their feelings and say, I feel sad or I feel angry. And that's true in the same sense that kids are going to have to develop an ego before they can go beyond the ego. And you want to help them develop a healthy ego, right? You can't bypass that step. And in the same way, don't try to bypass the step of helping kids learn how to express. But also emphasize even more strongly, if you can, this attention to the facts of the matter before interpretation. You might ask the child, what do you feel in your body? And yes, there's a certain, value to socializing them into these emotion words, but I think it's pretty important that that how these sensations and experiences are interpreted into emotions varies a lot from culture to culture. And so it's not actually true that what you're interpreting as anger actually is anger. So just be careful what kind of story you're selling the child, and instead investigative exploration of what it feels like to be them in that moment, right? At a more fundamental level. Yeah, and so Bill mentions that Mark Davis disagrees with this stance, and perhaps we can have a debate about this at some point. But this is exactly what Lisa Bennett, on the basis of a lot of research, is saying is wrong. She would argue Mark Davis is wrong in saying that emotions are hardwired, and I think the research supports her position. And we just don't realize how quickly we condition, babies, let alone children, right? So there's this fascinating study in which a baby crying, when people thought it was a boy, whether or not it actually was, they interpreted the crying as anger and frustration much, much more often. And when they thought the baby was a girl, they interpreted the crying as sadness and desperation much, much more often. And actually, it had nothing to do, with the actual gender or with the actual expression. It had everything to do with what they thought the gender of the baby was. It totally influenced not everyone, but to a great, great extent, their interpretation of what they were seeing right in front of their faces. Okay. So if we are, using these words to babies, on the basis of our cultural conditioning, especially gender conditioning, right from the get-go, of course it's going to seem like emotions are hardwired, you know. Now I would say, of course, certain things are hardwired, um, physiologically, right? Babies are hardwired to cry when they're hungry, when they're uncomfortable, when their diaper's too dirty, stuff like that, you know. But those aren't really what we would call emotions. Well, maybe they're what you call emotion, but maybe we can distinguish between physiologically hardwired expressions like crying in that circumstance, and others. Um, yeah. So please notice. Please take time to notice how am I framing this? Because unless you have a lot of meditation practice and a lot of kind of awakeness, you are compulsively framing almost everything, you know. So ask yourself, just investigate it, but before you even try to change it, how am I framing this? Um, Very, very important. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, so this video is probably long enough now. These days, nobody watches this video longer than half an hour, so maybe I should wind it up. Um, But Angela points out that even physical pain can be experienced differently when it's felt as sensation without story. Yeah, I specifically invite with what you tend to call pain. In I specifically invite experiencing it as intensity, and see if you can drop the label pain, right? And maybe you can even feel towards the possibility that intensity is an expression of aliveness. Lastly, Daniela says, what if you're attacked and you react? Fear and anger are there before you have time to frame the experience. No, what's there is adrenaline, nervous system arousal, heart pounding. We just interpret those as fear or anger. The emotion's not given. Okay. Now notice, if you're attacked, even just verbally, not even physically, you get this arousal, and that's because we're evolutionarily hardwired to be able to do our best to fight if we have to fight. Okay, so the arousal is hardwired, but the interpretation of it as fear or anger is not. But notice again, as soon as the interpretation's there, you can have a feedback loop, where you're unambiguously saying angry words, yeah, because that's you've interpreted your sensations as anger, and now you're in the anger loop, you know. So yeah, consider that, please. Um, so yeah, if you have nervous system arousal that you interpret as fear, that is a survival strategy. And interpreting it as fear, whether a second later, a minute later, a day later, is not necessarily helpful. It's neither here nor there. But it's also important to notice that if you're traumatized, please note, if you're traumatized, you will have a nervous system arousal that you tend to call fear, even if there's nothing to be afraid of. That's simply a consequence of having unresolved trauma in your system. So just because you feel this arousal doesn't mean there's a good reason for it. In the present moment, that is. There is a good reason for it, and it's in the past. It's unresolved past. Okay? So there's, I'll get a little bit geeky here at the end, because there's a fantastic science fiction novel called Dune. Some people think maybe the greatest science fiction novel of all time. So people do enjoy it who don't enjoy science fiction, some of them sometimes. And I love this book. I haven't read fiction in many, many years now, but I love this book. And there's a litany against fear. That's a kind of one of the spiritual transmissions of this particular book. Many of you know it. And it starts out, fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that brings total obliteration. But I would nuance and correct that to say, direct experience interpreted as fear is the mind killer. And then I think it's true what it's saying, right? But then Litany goes on to say, I will face my fear, I will permit it to pass over me and through me. And there I would reframe to, I will face my intensity, right? And permit it to pass over me and through me. And then it says, where it has and where it has gone, right through me, I will turn my inner eye to see its path, and I will realize that only I remain. And there's a little pun there on I and I. Only consciousness remains. So yeah, there's a whole spiritual reading possible of this litany against fear. Yes, even though the guru can appear in strange places, and the guru principle, guru tattva, and I think that's a powerful teaching, even though it came from a science fiction book. Okay, those of you who are watching live, please stay tuned for another video on the VBT. Yes, getting back to the VBT. I know some of you guys are like, where did it go? So see you soon for that VBT video here in the group. Om.